The SS Celestial glided through the vastness of space, its sleek hull reflecting the faint glow of distant stars. This mission was meant to be a simple peacekeeping endeavor, a chance to strengthen fragile alliances between humans and other species. But for Sergeant Alan Rivers, it was a test of her resolve. The coalition had sent her to ensure this diplomatic voyage remained orderly and that each species aboard respected the uneasy truce holding them together. Alan adjusted her uniform as she strode through the corridors, her boots echoing on the metallic floors. The camouflage pattern of her suit stood out against the sterile metallic walls, yet it was the insignia on her chest, marking her as human, that seemed to attract the most attention. The sight of her insignia alone could stir tension, and she felt the weight of that with every step she took. As she entered the main cabin, Alan surveyed the passengers. She recognized the varied forms and faces of species she had only read about in briefing files. The trillion tacticians sat apart, their translucent skin shimmering under the cabin lights as they exchanged quiet, coded gestures. Nearby, a cluster of Takar stood motionless, their tall, insect-like forms exuding an aura of silent contemplation, their pheromone communication detectable only to each other. Yet it was the Grawl that caught her eye. With their thin bodies and large, almost haunting black eyes, they were a disquieting presence. Known for their silence and enigmatic nature, the Grawl were not a species one could easily understand. They had a reputation for secrecy and stealth, and there was something about their unblinking gaze that set her on edge. Alan approached her seat, only to find one of the Grawl already occupying it. She took a deep breath, composing herself before addressing the creature. "I believe this is my seat," she said, keeping her tone neutral. The Grawl stared back, its black eyes void of any discernible emotion. It did not move, nor did it acknowledge her words. Alan felt a spark of irritation but pushed it aside. This mission was not about her. She was here to represent Earth, to uphold the fragile peace. With a steady hand, she reached into her pocket and retrieved a small slip of paper, a relic she had kept from a simpler time. It was a message she had prepared, one she hoped would convey a sense of peace, a gesture that she was here to cooperate, not to dominate. She extended the note to the Grawl. "Take this. It's a message of peace." The Grawl regarded the note for a moment, its thin fingers extending to accept it. Without a word, it slipped the paper into its long, bony hand, tucking it away without looking at the contents. Alan felt a strange sense of unease, as if she had given away more than just a message on a piece of paper. She took a seat a few rows back, her mind racing. The quiet acceptance of her note by the Grawl had been both unsettling and strangely foreboding. The SS Celestial hummed with the steady rhythm of its engine, but the atmosphere within felt heavy, charged with an undercurrent of tension. This wasn't just a diplomatic mission. It felt like a prelude to something much larger, something lurking just beyond the stars they were sailing past. As the minutes ticked by, Alan watched the stars blur into streaks of light, the ship surging deeper into the unknown. She knew this journey would test not just her skills, but her understanding of peace itself. For aboard this ship, the concept of peace was not a given. It was a fragile thread, strained under the weight of mistrust and old grudges, one that could snap at any moment. Alan settled into her new seat, letting her gaze wander over the other passengers. It wasn't lost on her that the atmosphere aboard the SS Celestial was growing more tense with each passing hour. The mixed species on board all seemed absorbed in their own thoughts, their expressions betraying hints of anxiety and unease. While the ship itself was designed for diplomacy, the passengers were a reminder of the stark divides that still existed. She took particular note of the Takar. Their pheromone communication, though silent to her, was visibly affecting the humans nearby. Alan could see a few humans shifting uncomfortably, glancing at the taker with suspicion. The trillions, meanwhile, exchanged murmurs among themselves, their translucent skins seeming to pulse faintly as they communicated in their unique, rhythmic cadence. Each species appeared to be locked within their own world, and Alan felt like she was standing at the center of a vast, invisible web of tension. Her thoughts were interrupted by a loud, angry exchange from across the cabin. Two humans, visibly intoxicated, had begun a verbal altercation with one of the Takar diplomats. The insectoid figure remained outwardly calm, but Alan knew from her training that such a response did not necessarily indicate peace. The Takar emitted a faint, acrid scent, signaling distress, and Alan realized that the situation was escalating quickly. She rose from her seat and approached the men, holding up her hands to diffuse the tension. "That's enough," she said firmly, her tone brooking no argument. The taller of the two humans, a rugged man with a scar across his face, turned his glare towards her. "What's it to you, Sergeant?" he spat, his eyes flashing with anger. "These things," he gestured at the Takar, "shouldn't even be here." "This mission isn't about personal feelings," Alan replied, stepping between the men and the Takar. "We're all here for the same purpose, to keep the peace." She felt the eyes of the passengers on her, the weight of their expectations pressing down on her shoulders. This was not the time for bravado or prejudice. The scarred man sneered but took a step back, muttering something under his breath. Alan held her ground, meeting his gaze with a steady calm until he finally backed down, dragging his companion away. The Takar emitted another faint whiff of pheromones, less harsh this time, and inclined its head towards Alan in a gesture of gratitude. Just as she was beginning to believe the tension had dissipated, she caught sight of movement from the corner of her eye. One of the Grawl was watching her closely. It was the same one who had taken her note earlier. Its large, dark eyes seemed to hold a question, or perhaps a challenge. She felt a shiver run down her spine, as if those unblinking eyes could see right through her. Alan offered a nod in return, acknowledging the silent observer. The Growl's expression was unreadable, yet something about its demeanor seemed to suggest it knew more than it let on. As Alan resumed her seat, her mind raced with questions. What were these creatures hiding? What was the Grawl trying to convey with its lingering stare? The SS Celestial hummed steadily onward, yet Alan could feel the undercurrents of something dark and ominous lurking just beyond the edges of this diplomatic mission. It was as if the ship itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable breach of peace. Alan's uneasy feeling only intensified as the hours passed. The steady rhythm of the SS Celestial's engines was suddenly disrupted by a blaring alarm that echoed through the corridors, shattering the tense silence that had settled over the cabin. The lights above flickered as the ship's emergency system sprang into action, sending everyone into an immediate state of alert. "Attention all passengers!" The ship's automated voice droned in a monotone over the intercom. "An unidentified vessel has been detected on an intercept course. All personnel are to remain seated and await further instructions." Alan's instincts kicked in, and she immediately assessed her surroundings. Fear flashed across the faces of the human passengers, especially those who had earlier instigated the altercation. The Takar's pheromone clouds thickened, while the trillions huddled together, their translucent skin taking on a faint, pulsating glow. The Grawl remained still and composed, as though this were something they had anticipated. The ship shuddered violently, forcing Alan to brace herself against the seat in front of her. She glanced towards the front of the cabin where the lead security officer, Lieutenant Hart, was already coordinating with the crew. Hart's face was set in a grim mask, his eyes fixed on the monitor as the intruding vessel drew closer. Without warning, a series of sharp metallic thuds reverberated through the ship, signaling the intruder's arrival. Alan reached for her sidearm, instinctively shifting into a defensive position. The air grew thick with tension, each passenger holding their breath as they awaited the inevitable. The boarding hatch hissed open, and from the shadows emerged a group of tall, thin figures. They wore sleek, dark suits and helmets that obscured their faces, their elongated limbs moving with an unsettling fluidity. The sight of them sent a chill down Alan's spine. These weren't ordinary pirates or raiders. There was an eerie precision in their movements, a cold efficiency that hinted at something far more dangerous. The intruders wasted no time. They began advancing through the cabin, weapons drawn and pointed at the passengers. Alan stood her ground, ready to defend herself and the others. The Grawl who had taken her note earlier locked eyes with her once more, its gaze steady, almost reassuring. It moved closer to her, as if prepared to take action. The first shot rang out, a red beam slicing through the air and striking the wall beside her. Alan ducked and rolled, narrowly avoiding the blast. She returned fire, her pulse pounding as she aimed for the closest intruder. The security team joined in, their weapons lighting up the dim cabin with flashes of blue and green. But it quickly became apparent that the attackers were more than prepared for resistance. They moved with a speed and agility that made them difficult targets. Alan gritted her teeth, her mind racing as she sought a way to level the playing field. The attackers had already neutralized 2 of the security officers, and their advance showed no signs of slowing. She scanned the cabin, searching for any advantage, any weak point she could exploit. Her gaze landed on an emergency control panel embedded in the wall, marked with a symbol she recognized from her training. It was a lockdown override, a last resort measure designed to isolate sections of the ship in the event of a breach. If she could reach it, she might be able to trap the intruders in this section, buying time for the rest of the crew to regroup. Alan weighed her options, the gravity of the choice pressing down on her. Activating the lockdown would mean sealing off the cabin with everyone inside, humans, trillions, Takar, and Grawl alike. She would be sacrificing their freedom to move in exchange for a chance at survival. The decision made, she lunged toward the panel, dodging another blast from the intruders. With a swift movement, she punched in the override code, and a series of heavy doors slid into place, sealing off the section. The intruders were trapped, at least temporarily. A tense silence settled over the cabin as the intruders assessed the new situation. Alan's heart raced, but a flicker of hope ignited within her. They had managed to hold off the attackers, but she knew it was only a matter of time before they found a way through. As the seconds ticked by, Alan stole a glance at the Grawl beside her. Its black eyes met hers, and for the first time, she thought she saw a glimmer of approval. Yet, something in its gaze hinted that this ambush was only the beginning, and Alan had a growing suspicion that the real danger lay far beyond what any of them could see. The cabin was now eerily quiet, the sudden lockdown isolating the intruders and leaving the remaining passengers in a tense lull. Alan remained on high alert, her gaze flitting between the sealed doors and the passengers who sat huddled in their seats, visibly shaken by the attack. But her thoughts kept circling back to the growl and the unnerving warning it had given her earlier. What did it mean by, "Your peace is coming, but not as you expect"? Unable to shake the feeling that she was missing something crucial, Alan made her way toward the bridge, intent on accessing the ship's classified files. There had to be more to this mission than they were being told, and with the intruders still trapped behind the reinforced doors, this might be her only chance to uncover the truth. Upon reaching the bridge, Alan found Lieutenant Hart still working frantically at the controls, his face tense as he struggled to regain control of the ship's systems. Alan wasted no time. "Lieutenant, I need access to the mission files," she demanded, her voice firm and unyielding. Hart shot her a skeptical glance but must have seen the resolve in her eyes, because he nodded and allowed her access. Alan swiftly navigated through the encrypted files, bypassing several layers of security until she found what she was looking for. Her heart pounded as the classified documents opened before her, revealing a secret that sent a chill down her spine. The SS Celestial was not merely a diplomatic vessel, it was carrying an experimental device known as the Nexus. According to the files, the Nexus was designed to manipulate space-time, a project so dangerous that it had been hidden even from most of the Coalition forces. The ship's mission wasn't one of peace but of subterfuge. They were using the guise of a diplomatic transport to test a weapon that could potentially alter the fabric of reality itself. As the magnitude of the deception sank in, Alan realized why the intruders had targeted the Celestial. They weren't here to raid or plunder. They were here to prevent the Nexus from being used. The sense of betrayal burned within her, twisting into a knot of anger and disbelief. The Coalition had sent them out here, risking countless lives, all for a device that could plunge the entire galaxy into chaos. Suddenly, everything made sense. The Graal's cryptic words, the calmness of the alien passengers during the ambush. It was as if they had known all along. Alan turned to Lieutenant Hart, whose face had grown pale as he read over her shoulder. "This isn't a peace mission," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's a weapon test. We've been used as bait." Hart's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing as he took in the implications. "Then we need to destroy it. Whatever it takes, we can't let that device fall into anyone's hands." Alan nodded, her mind racing with possible courses of action. They couldn't allow the Nexus to continue on its path toward completion, not when its existence threatened every species aboard the ship. She moved to the communication panel and activated the security override, locking down access to the cargo bay where the Nexus was stored. Her gaze shifted back to Hart. "We'll need to keep the intruders contained while we figure out how to dismantle it," she said, formulating a plan even as she spoke. But in the back of her mind, a gnawing suspicion remained. If the Graal had known about this, how many others were aware of the Nexus? And what were they willing to do to ensure it was never unleashed? As she stood there, piecing together the fragmented clues, Alan sensed a presence behind her. Turning, she saw the same Graal that had taken her note earlier. It moved toward her with a deliberate calmness, its dark eyes focused intently on her face. "You know the truth now, human," it rasped in a low voice that only she could hear. "But what will you do with it?" The Graal's words hung heavily in the air, the weight of its gaze pressing down on her like a physical force. Alan felt the enormity of the decision before her. This wasn't just about stopping a weapon. It was about choosing the fate of everyone aboard the SS Celestial, and possibly beyond. The weight of the Graal's words lingered as Alan faced the grim reality of their situation. She knew there would be no easy way out. With the truth now exposed, Alan had a difficult choice. Destroy the Nexus and risk the wrath of the Coalition, or attempt to hold off the intruders long enough to secure the device. But if the Graal was right, this wasn't just about stopping an enemy, it was about preventing a galactic catastrophe. Taking a steadying breath, Alan turned to Lieutenant Hart, who was already preparing for the worst. "We need to dismantle the Nexus," she said, her voice firm with resolve. "It's the only way to ensure it doesn't fall into anyone's hands, not theirs and not ours." Hart nodded, but his eyes held a flicker of doubt. "The Coalition won't take this lightly. They sent us here with explicit orders to protect it, not destroy it." "Are you sure about this, Sergeant?" Alan's gaze hardened. "If we let this device stay intact, it's only a matter of time before someone tries to use it. The Coalition has been keeping this secret for a reason, and I have no intention of letting it wreak havoc across the galaxy." She checked her weapon, her decision made. "Besides, those intruders are here to stop it. I'd rather side with them than let us all be responsible for the destruction this thing could cause." The bridge doors slid open, revealing the intruders who had finally breached the ship's defenses. They moved with a purpose, their sleek armor glinting under the emergency lights as they took in their surroundings. Hart raised his weapon, but Alan held out a hand, signaling for him to lower it. One of the intruders stepped forward, and as it approached, its helmet retracted, revealing a face that looked almost human, close enough to be unsettling, yet different enough to remind her that these beings were not of Earth. The intruder spoke, its voice calm and steady. "We are not here to kill you. We are here to prevent a catastrophe. The device you carry cannot be allowed to exist." Alan met the intruder's gaze, feeling the intensity of its conviction. "We know," she replied. "We want the same thing. But if you're here to stop the Nexus, then you need to help us dismantle it, fast." The intruder nodded, signaling to its companions, who immediately began moving toward the cargo bay. Alan fell into step beside them, feeling a strange sense of unity with these strangers. They were no longer enemies, but reluctant allies brought together by a common goal. As they reached the cargo bay, the security team joined them, wary but compliant. Alan could sense their hesitation, the uncertainty in their eyes as they watched her and the intruders working together. She knew they would follow her lead, but the unspoken question lingered. Could they trust these beings? Without hesitation, the intruders set to work on the Nexus, their movements precise and efficient. Alan observed as they opened panels and recalibrated circuits, disarming the device with a skill that left no doubt as to their purpose. As they worked, she felt a strange mixture of relief and trepidation. They were close to neutralizing the threat, but she knew that every second counted. Suddenly, a shout echoed from the other side of the bay. One of the coalition officers had drawn his weapon, aiming it at the intruders with a look of sheer determination on his face. "You're not going to get away with this!" he yelled, his voice thick with desperation. This mission was our chance to show strength, to prove humanity's place in the galaxy. Alan stepped forward, raising her hands in a calming gesture. "Stand down," she said firmly. "This isn't the way. We have to think of the bigger picture. The Nexus is a threat to everyone." The officer hesitated, his gaze flickering between Alan and the intruders. "You're betraying your own kind for them?" he asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "I'm preventing a disaster," Alan replied, her voice cold and unyielding. "We were deceived. This device isn't a symbol of strength, it's a weapon of chaos, and I won't let it be used." Before the officer could respond, one of the intruders disarmed him with swift precision, the weapon clattering to the floor. The officer sank back, realizing he was outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Alan turned her attention back to the Nexus, her resolve steeling as the final components were dismantled, rendering the device inert. As the last piece of the Nexus was neutralized, a collective sigh of relief filled the bay. Alan met the intruder's gaze, a silent understanding passing between them. They had succeeded, but the consequences of their actions were far from over. With the Nexus dismantled, Alan knew there would be repercussions. The Coalition would not take kindly to their disobedience, and the passengers who had witnessed everything would have questions of their own. But in that moment, as the intruders began to withdraw, Alan felt a sense of peace, however fleeting it might be. The crisis had been averted, yet the shadow of the Coalition's secret loomed large. Alan knew that the path ahead would be fraught with challenges, but she was ready to face them. She had chosen her side, and now there was no turning back. With the Nexus deactivated and the immediate threat contained, Alan felt a surge of relief, tempered by the realization of what lay ahead. The SS Celestial was no longer under attack, but the ramifications of their actions would ripple far beyond this ship. The intruders, now their allies, had started to depart, their silent efficiency leaving behind an unsettling calm. As they prepared to leave, the intruder who had spoken to her earlier turned back, meeting her gaze one last time. "You have made a wise choice, human," it said, a hint of respect in its tone. "May this be a lesson for your kind." Alan nodded, absorbing the weight of its words. She watched as the intruders filed out of the cargo bay, their forms soon disappearing into the shadows. The passengers and crew, who had witnessed the dismantling of the Nexus, remained silent, their faces etched with a mixture of shock and relief. She could sense the questions bubbling beneath the surface, but for now, no one spoke. They were all grappling with the enormity of what had just transpired. Returning to the bridge, Alan took a seat and let the tension of the past hours wash over her. Lieutenant Hart approached, his expression one of somber understanding. "So, what now?" he asked quietly, the weight of the mission's failure hanging heavily in his voice. "We report the truth," Alan replied, steeling herself for the inevitable fallout. "The Coalition will know that the Nexus is gone, and they'll know why we did it. We may not have followed orders, but we did what was necessary to protect everyone, human and alien alike." Hart nodded, his gaze distant. "They'll come after us, you know. The Coalition doesn't take well to defiance, especially when it involves classified technology." Alan met his eyes, her resolve unshaken. "Then we face them together. We can't let fear dictate our actions. We saw the danger and we acted. There's no turning back now. She looked out at the stars, her mind racing with the implications of their decision. The galaxy was vast, filled with mysteries and dangers, but for now, they had prevented one threat from taking shape. The Graal who had given her the cryptic message earlier appeared beside her, its black eyes holding an inscrutable expression. "You chose well," it said softly, the words carrying a weight that resonated deep within her. "Remember, peace is not just the absence of conflict, but the presence of understanding." Alan nodded, feeling a profound sense of connection with the alien being. She had not expected to find an ally in the Graal, but in the end, they had shared the same goal. She offered a small, respectful bow, acknowledging the bond that had formed between them amidst the chaos. As the SS Celestial turned back toward known space, Alan felt a sense of closure, yet also an awareness that their journey was far from over. The truth would need to be shared, and the Coalition held accountable for the secrets it kept. But she was ready to face whatever came next. They had risked everything, not for personal gain but for the greater good, and in doing so they had forged an unlikely alliance. The ship, forever marked by this mission, now carried a crew and passengers changed by the experience. As they journeyed back home, Alan found herself contemplating the fragile peace they had fought to preserve, knowing that it was a victory measured not by conquest, but by the courage to make the right choice. The stars stretched out before them, vast and unknowable, as the SS Celestial embarked on the journey home, a journey that would shape them all in ways they could not yet fathom.